Hello everybody, it's Foxy speaking, and welcome to another episode of Foxy's Fun Inspirational Chats. And today I will be your host. And in this episode, I thought I might represent this episode in making this the representation of the values of classic car event attending, and as well bus rally attending, and vintage vehicular event attending, and vintage rally attending. As a lot of you may know by now, though I'm still a rail enthusiast and a bus enthusiast as well, I am also a classic car enthusiast too. I absolutely love classic cars, since being introduced to classic car running events by my wonderful, wonderful best friend David Scott, and as well being introduced to vintage rally events again by David Scott himself too. I got thrown into the event attending with the intent of interest and passions and things. So interested and so passionate, I could never regret going to these wonderful events. I do not look back. Not once do I look back on the decision I've made to take up the relishing enthusiasm of classic car event attending and vintage rally event attending. But I had been bus rally attending before, but I only attended about 1 or 2 bus rally events a year for a few years before meeting David. It was only after meeting David I began attending more events and had more events in my calendar. Some weekends I didn't always know what to do, other than just go on a bus or a train sometimes on a certain weekend prior to meeting up with David. But since meeting up with David, now come spring, summer, autumn, and then until the middle to latter part of autumn, my calendar is now just filled with event attending, provided I'm not going abroad, holiday abroad with my family, or as my friend Dave Bryan would say, okay, well, provided you're not jetting off, you'll be able to go to a classic car running event or vintage rally event as per your intention, or, and certainly when Hove Park Miniature Railway and things are not running and all that, I just get thrown into attending a classic car running event and vintage rally event and things, with the great set of intentions and all that. But getting into the values of attending classic car rally event attending and vintage rally event attending, or vintage vehicular event attending, or car show event attending. Well, one of the greatest values of going to these events is you feel a sense of pride and appreciation that there are these enthusiastic owners who have purchased these fascinating old cars and as well not let them go to scrap. Because old cars, if all old vintage cars went to the scrap heap, it would be terrible and our history would die if that happened. So I think it's one of the greatest things and the greatest of values that classic car owners have purchased the classic car of vintage that they preferably like. You feel a sense of pride and appreciation for the old vehicles, as I've for a long time had a sense of pride. I've always liked all things old, like old cars, old buses, anything vintage, old clothes, old shoes, that sort of thing, I've always liked them. It was only until I met David that I began to like it even more and began to feel a far greater sense of pride and appreciation since getting thrown into those event attendings. It was extraordinary and fantastic, And in a way you sort of feel like you're time travelling to some extent. You see all these old but enchanting, and in a way some very picturesque with fantastic paintwork. You really feel like sometimes you're time travelling when you're at a classic car event and you're looking at all the classic cars lined up where they've been parked from several different eras, from pre-war, during the Second World War, post-war, the 1950s, 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s. I think it only goes up to about 1990s for classic cars at the moment. All those eras. You just go through all those eras and you look at those cars. I mean, it's just fantastic and extraordinary. And you really feel like you're travelling back in time when you're seeing them. You truly do. You'd think, oh my goodness. I mean, obviously I'll wait. Should any of you take up classic car running or event attending and things, should you take this interest up, I'll leave it for you to decide what your take would be on those events. So, I've always felt like I was time travelling to some extent whenever classic car event attending. Yes. And also one of the greatest things about classic car event attending is obviously seeing the classic cars and seeing the place of location, and also it also brings a sense of socialization between oneself. In a way, they're breeding grounds for socialization, as I've found whenever attending those events. Because, socialization is always important, especially in a classic car event. Sorry. Sorry. Something got a little stuck. My apologies. That's always the greatest thing, and it's sort of changed me quite considerably since going to these events, because I've always found not only the sense of pride and appreciation for old vehicles and old classic cars, but and because I'm a sociable man, I always found it was good for me to go to these events because of the socialisation you have with other spectators who may be attending, and as well having friendly conversations with the classic car owners themselves, That's always the greatest upside value of classic car event attending. But there is a downside with classic car event attending. Well, quite a lot of you may already know this, as I may have said a very great many times before, and some of you already know. And I remember it was one of you, I think it was, who said that because of well, I'll say it later. Okay, I'll certainly say it later. The only downside regarding classic cars, dependent on what era of make it is, or manufactured make, or the era it was built in, they are not necessarily built for people who stand over a certain height, which is the only issue. They're not necessarily built for people who are, say, anything overshooting the 5'6" range is what I would say. And sometimes, and with me, being 5'8" in height, because I'm 5'8", as I've said to you before, 5'8" with size 8 shoes, well, feet and shoes, that is, that's HUK I was referring to, or 9 US, or EU 42. I'm not exactly small, and sometimes being even my height, or certainly, imagine, taller, sometimes that could be a problem to clamber inside and out of small classic cars, not to mention a small classic Mini. Every time I've tried to get in and out of a small classic Mini, I'm like, oh my goodness, it is tricky to get in and out. And to get out, it's, oh goodness, it's tricky to get out. Oh my goodness, you know. And I'm like, they're really not built for people over a certain height, are they? You'd have to be probably 5'6" and smaller than 11 stone to be an ideal fit to just get in and out easily. Oh my goodness. As I've so found, you know. Not just a small classic Mini, but any classic car that is small. That's the downside regarding classic car events, is many of the small classic cars, dependent on manufactured make and the decade era they were built in, they're not necessarily built for people who are, say, anything overshooting the 5'6" range, being over a certain height, as I've so experienced for myself since I have overshot the 5'6" range. But the big ones, I could just get in and out easily without trouble. But I obviously feel sorry for those of you who have overshot not just the 5'6" range, but if you've overshot anything past my height of 5'8", and to just see you trying to get in and out of a small classic car, it would definitely be quite tricky. I mean, it's different once you're inside, but it's to get in and out, it's the tricky part. And sometimes there's a lack of headroom. Well, particularly in a classic Mini, once I've sat inside it, it's different when sat inside, but there's just a lack of headroom. And I have a picture of me sitting, posing in a classic Mini, but my head at the top of the very top of the car, that headroom was lacking. Oh my goodness, the headroom was lacking. And one of my friends, well, she's taller than I am, and her husband is 6 foot in height, shorter than that of my 6'2" friend Mark, and my 6'3" friend Tommy. She actually said to me, these minis are so cute, but I know I wouldn't fit. She came under the impression that because of her tall height, she wouldn't be able to fit inside and out of a small classic Mini. Well, sorry, a little stuck. But it'll be fine. It'll be alright. Well, what I can say is that for those of you who have overshot the 5'8" range, which is obviously because I'm at 5'8" in height, for those of you who are taller than that, well, it's certainly a small classic Mini, it will inevitably be tricky to clamber inside and out of it. You may find it would be, but obviously I'll leave it for you to decide if you would experience it for yourselves. You may find it's different once sat inside, but obviously you would quite likely find, certainly from my experiences I've found, to get in and out, that would be the trickiest of parts, you know. But unless you were, say, a large classic car of any make, be it a large Chevy or a large Dodge or any classic car that's big, it's highly unlikely you would find the challenge of getting inside and out of it compared to the small ones. Convertible, small or big, I think you may find it's not 100% easier, but it's slightly easier to clamber inside and out of. But the only thing is, if you'll say anything over 5'6", as I'd giving some advice, and from experiences I've personally experienced, because obviously I'm not going to repeat it, but if you're anything over 5'6" is what I would say, anything height taller than that, well, any height taller than that, I need to correct the sentence saying, as I experienced, I had to be careful not to fall face first into the gear stick or the floor pedals to get in and out of a convertible. Though I did find it slightly, not 100%, but slightly easier to clamber inside and out of the small classic convertible, provided I was careful not to fall face first into the gear stick and the floor pedals. Had that happened, I would have been severely injured and I would likely have a bandage wrapped round my face if had I not been careful to get in and out of the convertible. Oh well. But aside from the downside, the upside of classic cars far, far outweighs the downside for people who are over a certain height. Something's a little stuck. I'll be alright. But I did recently have a chest infection, but I'm over the chest infection now. But something got a little stuck in the throat at the moment, but once it's not stuck, the cough should be gone. Sorry about that. Yes. But if I may say once again, I'm sorry I didn't spit it out completely. The downside of classic cars I would say far outweighs, the upsides far outweighs the downsides of classic cars when it comes to event attending. I mean, I could be wrong saying this, but giving a suggested recommendation for those of you who may be aspiring to attend a classic car running event, if you've, say, found out about one that's taking place either within your hometown of locality or fairly nearby, or a few short miles away from your hometown of locality, I think you would find it may well change you as a person if you attend. I mean, it's just my opinion, and I'm just saying this from my own experience, but for those of you who are aspiring to go classic car event attending one day in the future, I will leave it for you to decide what your experiences were with attending the classic car event as a spectator, whether you felt it changed you or not. Well, obviously it'll be your experiences and not mine, because my experiences are obviously going to be incredibly different compared to yours. I'm not saying there's no offence, I'm just making a point. You know. And the next thing, if I may share the values of vintage rally attending. Vintage rally attending is extraordinary. The first time I went, I thought I was nearly in heaven, with the fairground organ music, do 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 do. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Do 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 Oh dear. Oh dear. That's right. That's right. Yes, those events, vintage rally event attending, honestly, the best values of vintage rally event attending is the soothing sounds of the fairground organs from my personal experiences with going. Honestly, I felt like I was going to a proper fairground with the fairground music I was never always familiar of. It wasn't just the organs that are the fascinating distinction I have found with vintage rally event attending, but when they have a little miniature railway, the classic cars, but also steam vehiculars as well, and there's one vintage rally I attend that has a narrow gauge railway. And some of you may already be familiar of that. I mean, I felt it just changed me as a person, and I must say, when I went, I was like, oh my goodness, I wish I'd known about it as a young child. Because had I gone as a little boy, I would have just absolutely loved the Vintage Rally event attending, but obviously we didn't know about it as a child. I was never familiar of it as a child, and nor were my parents familiar of it, which was why we never went. But for whenever I have children one day in the future, I would definitely want to take them to a vintage rally. As many children I've seen going to vintage rallies, I've seen they look to be quite happy going, you know. But the greatest thing about vintage rally event attending, it's not just the organs or potential railways they have, or the steam vehiculars and classic vehiculars and agricultural tractors they may have and things, or vehicular show events and all that in the show arena at some vintage rally showgrounds. Also, they are a fantastic events for the breeding grounds of socialisation as well, as I've so found. And also it really in a way sort of brings you back in time too, like classic car events, you know. And last but not least, vintage vehicular event attending. Vintage vehicular event attending is just as extraordinary as classic car event attending. You see lots of vintage vehiculars, like say historic commercial vehicles or HCVS events, namely how one might describe a vintage vehicular event is really, I would say, from likely the HCVS, you know, HCVS event. HCVS stands for Historic Commercial Vehicle Society. Sorry, and my goodness, do they. The HCVS events I've attended are extraordinary. The experiences I've so found when going to a HCVS event, you know, honestly, the old vehicles are brilliant. And you see when I went, I saw vehicles I could never possibly imagined or dreamt I would see in a lifetime. I was like, oh my eyes popped the first time I went to a HCVS event, which was the Hastings Sprat and Winkle event. And since going there, I could just never stop going now. There are generally 2 HCVS events I attend. The Hastings Sprat and Winkle HCVS event and the London to Brighton HCVS run, which I attended back in 2022. It was going to go ahead in 2023, but it did not go ahead because of the King's coronation. And because of the King's coronation, they decided to cancel off the event in respect for our monarch, His Majesty the King, Charles III, when he got crowned for his special coronation weekend. But it's going ahead in 2024, fortunately enough. As would almost certainly the Hastings Sprat and Winkle HCVS run too. And what I would say the greatest values of vintage vehicular event attending is the values of it are representing and feeling the deepest depth of appreciation for these old vehicles, like with the classic cars and vintage rallies, but also, and as well, sense of pride, but also the breeding grounds for socialisation too, but the fascination is beyond valuable. The fascination of those events, it's just, vintage vehicle events, Rufolo, is greatly full of admirable fascination, as I've so found, you know, yes, and I think that's about the representation for classic car running event attending, vintage rally event attending, and vintage vehicular event attending and things. Vintage rally, classic car, vintage vehicular. All three in covered. You know. And I must say, since getting into those three types of events, but obviously there are several events within those genre types I've attended now, or attend every year now, as a lot of you may already know. My experiences whenever going to these events, honestly, they are so valuable and extraordinary. Would I thoroughly recommend oneself to attend those events? I would say yes, if they so wanted to and had an aspiring interest to attend those events. I would say yes, go right ahead and attend it if you so wanted to and so wish, indeed so. That's what I would say as a means of certain advice. But, the values of those events attending, I think obviously you're all going to have different experiences if you did decide to happen to attend those events. It's just my opinion. But I truly believe it may change you as a person. But just my opinion, obviously it's not my experience, it'll be your experience, which will be completely different to mine. That's all I can really say to it. But for those of you who do take an interest in attending those events, I'd certainly recommend you go, if you wanted to. But that's my review and sharing the values and greatness of classic car event attending, vintage rally event attending, and vintage vehicular event attending. That's all I had to represent in its full entirety of coverage. Thanks all indeed for watching. It's a special thanks to David Scott, my best friend, who got me into attending those events, and as well special thanks to Dave Bryan for taking me under his wing. Since first encountering him, he's taken me under his wing quite a bit and given me quite a bit of valuable advice when it comes to classic car event attending and things and all that. So I have two people to thank. Obviously David Scott I'm thankful and grateful largely enormously towards. And of course Dave Bryan I'm also thankful and grateful towards too. It's helped me to not only deepen my interest in those event attendings, but appreciate them enormously too. Thanks for watching, and ta-ta another time. From Foxy.